Everybody, thanks for joining me. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Kathi Enderes. I'm the Vice President of Josh Bersin Research. If you're trying to guess my accent, I'm originally from Austria, and now I live in beautiful San Francisco. Professionally, my background is kind of a geek. My PhD is in abstract mathematics, but for the last 2 decades, I haven't worked in that field, but I worked in client-facing management consulting roles with EY, PwC, and IBM, and then as a talent executive at McKesson and Kaiser Permanente. In the last 5 years, I've led research in the areas of HR and talent, and learning and HR technology at Deloitte, and now with Josh and the team at the Josh Bersin Academy. I want to share with you some insights we have from studying resilience and equity and employee experience. So let's jump right in. Last year was really a perfect storm. It's about responding not just to the pandemic, but the economic cycle of the last 15 years. We've all seen topics come up like future of work and agile business transformation and digital and new technologies, income inequality, workforce health and well-being, and last year it all happened. All of these things became common and real, and HR had to step up in a very big way. The labor market is red hot again. Every company we talk with is hiring. They're trying to keep up. I just read in the news how the market is ramping up. And so we'll find us yet again in this war for talent, where we need to find new ways to attract people, to retain people, to engage people, and also to empower them to do the work of their life. As we think through the pandemic, this has been an incredible journey. As much as it has impacted all of us personally, professionally, I'm sharing with you, for example, today from my home office in San Francisco, it's also helped all of us jumpstart transformation and find new business models, new work environments, start working remotely and in a hybrid way and in a more dynamic work experience. So what have we learned from the pandemic? We studied the pandemic responses of over 1,400 companies to understand what of all the things organizations can do drive business performance like financial success, customer satisfaction, people outcomes like engagement and retention, and innovation outcomes like change agility or the ability to innovate effectively. And what we learned there is really fascinating. Of all the things that you can be doing in response to the pandemic, there's really 10 practices that matter most. And they have to do with health and well-being, driving agility and change, and the new real-time way to manage people. Some of these practices might seem obvious, but they're not easy to execute well. For example, developing an aggressive platform for employee health and well-being and family support forces organizations to think in different ways. Not only do companies have to disinfect their workplace, design new travel work protocols, all of those kind of things, they have to listen to employees and their fears. Sanofi, for example, has decided that each employee can decide when and how they come back to the office. Similarly, many big companies are designed to focus on compliance and scale, but empowering people to rapidly come up with new programs, rapidly roll them out, takes a whole new muscle. And that's something that some organizations just don't have yet. PepsiCo, for example, they created a new onboarding program in a matter of weeks. Usually that would have taken them months to do. We have a great case study in our paper that I'll share with you. And finally, the practices of adaptive talent management, rapidly redeploying people, hiring temporary workers, reorganizing teams into multifunctional projects, and radically simplifying performance management. All of these are programs that often take months or even years to complete. Our research found that some companies adapted very, very fast. It was often because they had developed this muscle to respond and transform early on. Organizations that do these three sets of practices well, they have much better performance. And all these practices are not specific to the pandemic. They're really broader and more strategic in nature, they're cultural in nature, and they all result in business resilience. Quickly hiring and redeploying people is the practice that has the strongest impact on financial performance. And why is that? That's because the pandemic is an economic transformation just as much as it's a public health problem. What does that mean when I say economic transformation? Well, many jobs declined in need, but others had to be ramped up very, very quickly. Sainsbury's, for example, it's a grocery store in the UK, very big one. They had to hire many new delivery drivers and in-store support people for various grocery services related to the pandemic. Norton Healthcare staffed up in critical care staff, and also they cross-trained many people, including HR people, for potential shortages in needed areas, not in medical areas, but maybe in the areas of receptionist or something like that. Southwest Airlines, they used a program that they already had in place. It's called Loan Your Love, an internal gig work program to help redeploy a lot of the flight attendants that were grounded into new areas and be really successful with that as well. Companies with the highest level of customer satisfaction are those who also focus on purpose and mission, because they quickly realign work for new customer needs. They don't just hire and redeploy people, but they also outperform in mission, and they're able to redesign goals, performance management, and jobs very quickly so employees can be more responsive to customers. And what does this look like in practice? IBM, for example, they kept their customer satisfaction high throughout the pandemic by focusing on the customer, and they supported their employees with information and tools for remote work. They changed to a remote service delivery model literally overnight, and they leveraged their agile performance management program to quickly recalibrate goals and expectations for new reality, because the goals that you set out in early 2020, of course, are not the same goals that you landed with maybe at the end of the year. Reliance Industries, AB InBev, many others also saw big jumps in customer satisfaction during the pandemic because they doubled down on helping people work differently. And then a focus on holistic well-being, and that includes health and safety, but also helping people deal with ambiguity, taking really good care of their families, has the highest impact on employee engagement. Employee health and safety are core concerns in the pandemic, but the best organizations go beyond that. They create an environment where people can deal with ambiguity, they can rest, they can regenerate themselves, they take really good care of their families. By doing so, they earn the trust and the loyalty of their workers. Deutsche Telekom, for example, they saw an enormous increase in employee satisfaction by 11 percentage points. And they also saw this enormous increase in brand identification, a 7% increase. And that's very, very big for a company that large. The company provided significant support for its employees to deal with feelings of confusion and loss. They created a leadership in crisis program that included remote workshops. They included 3 toolkits, one on survival, one on reflection, and one of creating the new normal. Legendary Entertainment, they focused on holistic well-being by providing subscriptions to Headspace and coaching and meditation sessions. And Southwest Airlines, they're already known as a great place to work, provided their workers with well-being webinars and other support. They also encouraged their employees to take care of themselves so they could continue to take care of others by reminding everybody to put on your own oxygen mask first. As we grouped all organizations together in different stages of response, we saw 4 stages emerge. So there's the 4 stages of pandemic response. In the first stage, that's where organizations try to pretend nothing happened, just wish the pandemic to go away. And they probably laid off a lot of people and just try to hang on and go back to normal. But then they focus on caring for people, protecting the employees, their customers, the suppliers, and really everybody from infection, and generally keeping well-being in mind. And the third stage has to do with agility and culture, working in cross-functional teams and moving fast. And then in the fourth stage, it builds on all the others. And that's where organizations don't just transform their business model, but also their talent processes. The gray circles there, they represent the percentage of organizations in each stage. So while less than 1 in 5 are in the hope for the best stage, almost every other organization is still in this second stage of caring for the people. So lots to do in terms of building business resilience. All right, the next topic we wanted to cover is equity. And elevating equity has been really a massive question in the last year. And of course, it continues to be a big priority for companies. It's the question of the decade. But why does it even come up for us in the pandemic? On one hand, the pandemic can be seen as a great equalizer. In one of our conversations, the chief learning officer of a Fortune 50 company said that because everybody from the CEO to the summer intern is the same size square on your Zoom, it's really the equalizer. No more corner offices, no more cubicles in the basement, and that's one way to look at it. But on the other hand, the pandemic has impacted women and people of color a lot more. Women are much more likely to be in industries with high rates of unemployment. Hospitality, food services, retail. Last fall, 53% of the US Black population was employed compared to 57% of the corresponding white population. Mothers are taking much more share of their the housework, the childcare work, equivalent to a half-time job, basically. In India, women reported a 30% increase in household responsibilities. So widening inequalities is actually part of the pandemic too. I just got my first Pfizer vaccine a few weeks ago, and I'm so grateful for the innovation. But let's look at some of these vaccines in more detail. And as we look here, both Moderna and Pfizer were founded or run by immigrants from different countries. Almost 1 in 2 patents in the US is done by immigrants. And why is that? Diversity of thought and background is really necessary for innovation. So without that, you really can't get innovation outcomes and this incredible innovation that we had with coming up with these vaccines so quickly. One reason why DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion is so challenging is there's no common definitions. And if you don't know what the goal is, how can you ever get there? These best of lists, best of diversity, best company for diversity, they are part of the problem. To show this, we compared 5 of these lists to see how much overlap there was. There were 205 companies on these lists. And there was a single company, and I'll let you guess who they were, and maybe I'll disclose it later on in Q&A, on all 5 lists. 3 companies on 4 lists, 9 on 3 lists, 35 on 2 lists. So that means 157 were on just one list. Now, if you think about other lists, best financial performance, perhaps strongest brand perception, there would be no doubt who would be on these lists, and there wouldn't be so many different lists to begin with. Think of the Fortune 500, for example. Is there ever a debate on how financial success is measured? Of course not. But when DEI is concerned, there's just no agreement, and that makes it so much harder to get there. So what we set out to do is to study the subject. And we did this big study where we studied 84 practices in DEI across more than 800 companies. And then we saw which of these practices, these organizational practices, actually correlate with outcomes. I'll share some of the insights with you, and you can also download the article where we have over 50 pages, lots of case studies and all of that. When we correlated these 84 practices against a series of outcomes, one practice was by far the most predictive of excellence, and that's listening to employees and acting on results. In fact, this practice was the strongest predictor of 5 out of 8 business, people, and innovation outcomes we reviewed. Why is listening so important? Listening is really important because it switches DEI from a compliance program to one that's focused on performance and on growth. When leaders listen and hear what diverse teams need, they understand the small things that make a big difference. When we truly feel empathy, when we listen, when we hear, when we respond, we're naturally more inclusive and diverse as a result. As organizations, we need a corporate-wide culture that focuses on listening first, then hearing what was said, and then taking appropriate actions. And what does this really look like? Autodesk, for example, for them, innovation is at the core of their business strategy, and they know that innovation is dependent on DEI. The company has a culture code that guides the work of everybody in the organization. Inclusion, belonging, vulnerability, all are part of this culture code. Managers get support and resources to actively listen to their team members in their check-ins, in their conversations that they have every day, and then they identify barriers to an inclusive environment, and then they work with the team to address these barriers. This commitment to listening, it's explicit at Autodesk, and it's part of the management approach, and people get trained for it, and they get developed for it, and they are held accountable for that too. Kira Fernandez, the Chief Diversity Officer at Target, said to us when we interviewed her, "You have to run DEI as a business function, not as an HR program." You wouldn't run your business strategy, your finance strategy, or your marketing strategy without measurements. And our study shows that there are 3 practices around metrics that drive success. Let's look at them in a little bit more detail. Excellent organizations use these practices for DEI metrics. First, an outside-in approach. Rather than looking just internally, the most successful companies invest in external benchmarking and comparison within and outside of their industry segments even as well. Target, Accenture, Kaiser Permanente, Tetra Pak, Siemens, many others, they have dedicated analytics teams, and some of you might be in these roles, who collaborate with various groups outside of the organization to identify metrics, to identify measurement that drive results. And then they help them apply a leading practices mindset to their DEI work. So outside in, focus on inclusion and belonging, not just representation. Representation metrics are really easy to measure, of course, but excellent organizations go beyond that and they add outcome goals for inclusion to the metrics mix. An inclusion index, for example, that you can derive from your employee survey is one way to do that. This could look like, are people feeling valued? Are they feeling respected? Can they grow regardless of their role? All of these measures have to be added to your inclusion metric index that you can measure and track and break down into actionable steps to make it better. Companies like Untapped or Glint or Medallia, all of the Perceptics, all of them can help you define such an index. And then the last area is transparency. Technology companies like Google and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, they all have been very transparent to external audiences about their DEI goals, and sometimes they're very ambitious. Sometimes they tout initiatives for creating equity for women and people of color in leadership teams and so on. And that might be well-intended, but these goals are often not met. And then they leave out a very important internal stakeholder, and that's the workforce themselves, the people that live and breathe the DEI results every single day. Rather than seeing DEI targets as publicity opportunities, these companies really focus or should focus on keeping their internal audiences apprised of progress. As we looked at the various levels of outcomes and the 15 practices that drive them, and you can read about them in our paper, we identified 4 levels of DEI maturity, and that comes from the least impactful to the most impactful. Organizations at level 1, they are focused on risk mitigation and compliance, and that's 40% of surveyed organizations. They focus on the legal risk, the compliance risk, their reputational risk that they might face if they're not creating diversity in their organizations. They're really not focused on inclusion nor equity. But when organizations start to listen, these organizations have leaders that believe in the business benefits of DEI. Company leaders start listening frequently to employees to identify barriers. So that listening, very, very important. Level 3 organizations are those that focus on with all of their strategies and commitments on DEI. And level 4 organizations, that's really where organizations don't just do all these other things that are at the lower levels, but they also hold themselves accountable for DEI outcomes. If you look at the circles there, just 20% of organizations actually hold themselves accountable for DEI outcomes, which means 80% of course of organizations don't hold themselves accountable for DEI. So lots of upward mobility and progress to do. Now, DEI is still an evolving field, and a lot has to do with listening better, understanding how you define it, and then helping remove barriers to DEI. Now, the last subject I wanted to cover is employee experience. And employee experience is really a massive program and a massive strategy for many organizations. A lot of tech vendors focus on that as well. But let's look at the problem first. What's the problem with employee experience, and why is it such a big topic? A study from Okta showed that the average large company has 120 different work systems for their employees. 120. Many studies also show we work longer, we have less boundaries of work and life, and they're just always on now. And that really creates a lot of pressure for us in our work and in our lives. Let's look at the connection between performance and engagement. Performance is really the other side of the coin of engagement, because what really drives engagement is the need to get work done, get stuff done. And so organizations really have to look at engagement and performance in a two-way street, if you want. So engagement, of course, drives performance and enables performance. But when people perform well, they're also more engaged, and then customers are more satisfied, and financial performance is better, and innovation is better, all that good stuff. So it's really not just a one-way street to focus on engagement. That's why we said we have to focus on more than engagement. We also have to focus on performance and productivity and well-being. A new study from Microsoft showed that people are really struggling in the new work environment where they're always on. Frontline workers and younger people, Generation Z, struggle more than anybody else. And so how can we create an environment where they can perform their best and do their best work? So we needed really to look at employee experience rather than just engagement. We create this framework of employee experience that's much broader than just the tools and technologies that they use. We really wanted to understand what drives business performance, like financial success, customer satisfaction, people outcomes like engagement and a sense of belonging, and innovation outcomes as well. And we'll look at the work that you do. Are you aligned with the values of the organization? Is your team supportive? Do you have time to recover and to innovate? Then we'll look at managers. Do they help you set good goals? Do they stretch you? Do they give you feedback and coaching? And is management something that your organization actually values as a capability? Then the workplace, of course, and not just the physical workplace, but also the work environment overall. Is it inclusive? Do I feel valued there? Can I speak up? Can I be who I am as a person? And then, of course, health and well-being, which has been massive in the pandemic response study. But going beyond just healthcare benefits to also care for your family and help you also be emotionally, mentally healthy and well. And then, can I grow here? Can I develop here? And this goes beyond topics like just learning, but also talent mobility. It's a massive question as well. Learning culture. And then to the right here, you see trust in the organization. Do I believe in the mission and the purpose of the organization? Is there a culture where I can thrive? Do I feel that leaders are empathetic? Do they act with integrity? Does the company invest in people? And do they do something that contributes to the bigger society and environment? So all of these topics for us encompass employee experience. It's much broader than engagement, and it's really all the interaction that an employee has with the company, with their co-workers, with their customers, with all of the points of interaction with the organization. And what we found when we studied this is very, very interesting. Trust is really the most impactful practice and the most impactful area. You see here that inclusive environment has a very big impact on all outcomes, as has creating a culture and a mission and a purpose that people can align with. But the good news is, if you're doing anything on this framework, it really can't go wrong. But if you have to prioritize, you might focus on those areas that also create purpose and culture. When we looked at what practices specifically are most impactful, we found out that it's all about people helping each other. Edgar Schein, he is a culture guru, and he has dedicated his life's work on researching culture. When he was asked about the most important insight on high-performing cultures, he said, it's where people help each other. So people helping each other is really, really outsized, has an outsized impact on all things, whether that's customer performance, financial performance, employee engagement, sense of belonging, innovation. All of those things are lifted when people can help each other. How does this relate to the things we do at HR and in people analytics? It relates a lot to that, because how managers, for example, work with their people, what goals they set, what they hold them accountable for, really resonates in the culture you create and if people can help each other. If you pit people against each other, if you have a competitive approach and a kind of this scarcity approach, people won't help each other because they will try to just get ahead. But if you focus on a growth mindset and an approach where people feel like they can grow and they can work together as a team, they will support each other, and that will help your customers as well. One interesting finding is about money. Paying people well is not enough, and in fact, it had a very negligible impact on outcomes. But if you make rewards and recognition fair and equitable, that's one of the 50 most impactful practices that you can do. So think about pay not just as the total package of pay, but how to make it more fair and more equitable. And don't just think about rewards, also think about recognition. Kraft Heinz, for example, where I had a great interview with them and will write up their story as well. They don't just focus on pay equity, but then also on recognition from all around, so everybody can recognize each other in doing great work. Technologies really matter too. As we compared the impact of technology in our EX study, we saw that it has a relatively small impact on overall outcomes, but the right technologies absolutely contribute to a great employee experience. And what are the right technologies? Advanced people analytics, advanced learning tools, and knowledge management tools are all kind of systems of design to design this outstanding employee experience. Unilever, for example, they're using all of these EX tools to support their comprehensive EX work. But they also have a head of employee experience who is accountable for integrating IT and HR and facilities, all these different points, because employee experience can't be done in just one function. It has to be really a cross-functional and cross-enterprise portfolio and strategy. Now, this is a people analytics conference, and if I didn't make a point about people analytics, I think I would be remiss. And I didn't make this up for this conference only, but people analytics is by far the most impactful organizational tech and service practice that we identified. And it's driving all these great outcomes for the organization. The retention might not surprise you because people analytics has been used to drive employee retention for decades. But look at the impact also on change, agility, and innovation. But the bad news is more than 4 in 5 companies, they're not there yet. They don't use advanced people analytics. So there's lots of upward opportunity for all of you to contribute to that. Here's our maturity model for EX, and we haven't published this, so this is kind of a little preview, a sneak peek for you, where you see organizations move through the different levels of maturity. On level 1, they're really focusing on a transactional relationship with their people, just focusing on efficiency and removing friction from their work. But level 2 is where they start focusing on culture, trust in leaders, open communication, and people helping each other. Level 3 brings in a business focus and the focus on also the mission and the purpose, and embed that in every interaction. And level 4 is where equity comes in, empowering everybody to do the work of their life. Microsoft frames everything with their purpose, and their purpose is actually very empowering. And it's what they say they want to do is they want to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. So that's a great mission, of course, a great purpose. And then with their culture, and they think about growth mindset, being customer obsessed, being inclusive and diverse, and being one Microsoft. Satya Nadella says, our culture is at the root of every decision we make at Microsoft. And creating this culture is my chief job as CEO. So seeing culture as the job of the CEO is kind of very interesting perspective. So what can you do with all of this now? Here's a few takeaways for you. As people analytics practitioners, listening at scale is absolutely important. It's critical. We found this in all our studies, listening all the time because your employees actually speak with you all the time. Listen actively, listen passively, sentiment analysis and O&A and surveys and pulse surveys, and using different tools to get results and insights out of that. And then the most important step, of course, is taking action on the results as well, because analytics are only as good as the actions they drive. The next thing you can do in HR, and we all can do in HR, is human-centered leadership. Leaders play really an outsized role in the success of all of the things: pandemic response, DI, and employee experience. And we see a new leadership model, a human-centered leadership model emerge. And that's one where people are first and business is second. People are not the means to an end, but the purpose of their business itself. And it has to do with leading people who drive the business forward, not having people just tag along for the ride. And that's really a massive shift and really hard work. But I encourage you to think about that shift, because without that shift, you're going to be facing an uphill battle without your leaderships on board. And the last topic I wanted to mention is culture. Culture is at the heart of employee experience and DEI and business resilience. We in HR don't own the culture. It has to come from the CEO, from the C-level leadership, but all we do has to tie to creating the right culture, to amplify it, to inspire the trust in the company that's necessary for companies not just to survive, but to thrive in this future of work. So with that, I think we're going to go to questions. Thank you.